Okay, AP World History students, this is the beginning of your review. And we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of this course, which began in 1200 as far as testable material and things of that nature. We, of course, did a little bit of review at the beginning of the year on the earliest of things, the importance of the Neolithic Revolution, for example, um, which led to civilization, to cities and specialization and all that good stuff. Okay. So let's look at the Unit 1 overview here. State building in Song, China. We get Dar al Islam. And then South and Southeast Asia. We get the Americas, Africa, and Europe, all around this time period of 1200. Now, before the year 1200, you have to understand that we've seen the rise and fall of many great and powerful civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, what we call the classical age. They've fallen, and this is what comes next, the post-classical period. It's a time where new religions take hold. We get new trade relationships being built around the world, none of which are possible without the agricultural or Neolithic revolution, of course. Let's begin in China. Your context, just like you were writing an essay, right? Your context. In a largely decentralized world, China had experienced decades of strong central control that resulted in a very prosperous China. Very heavily centralized in the Qin dynasty. Remember, the period before this was the Warring States period. It was very decentralized. Shi Huangdi, of course, is the emperor of the Qin dynasty who founds it. And remember, it only lasts really through him and a couple of years of his son, and it falls apart because they were ruthless. But they introduced a very strong central bureaucracy that would survive them and would expand under Song China. And this showed an example of continuity in East Asia. So the move is towards centralization in China, even after Shi Huangdi dies, of course, and he has the elaborate tomb and everything. The Tang dynasty would come in after the Song dynasty. They would improve agriculture in the roads and canals. They would pretty much build on what the Song did and make it better. This encouraged foreign trade and allowed Song China to be the economic powerhouse of the world in the post 1200 world. Both Song and Tang Empire, which comes after it, are the economic powerhouses. The Song dynasty, of course, is small. Song of the South. They're basically going to let the North go to the the Jin Empire, and they're going to concentrate on the South. The Tang will get all that land back and will be one of the largest periods in Chinese history. They will own a considerable amount of land. Now, the bureaucracy, the government in China, centralized imperial bureaucracy based off of the civil service exam, which is merit exams, meaning you have to, it doesn't matter what your last name is, you have to know the material. Song China expanded the imperial bureaucracy, making it easier for lower class people to take the exam and enter the government. There were no barriers per se. You just had to be able to pay for it. So, if a peasant couldn't pay for it, then that was a barrier, of course. But other than that, if you can scrape together enough money, you can take the exam and you're not going to be a peasant anymore. You can go get a job working for the government. This eventually hurt Song China as the large bureaucracy became too expensive to maintain. You got to pay these people a decent wage. And it's sort of like now where we have almost too many people going to college and vying for degrees and stuff. And now you don't have enough plumbers and welders and things of that nature. That's sort of what happens here in China. The Chinese meritocracy system provided more upward mobility than any other government hiring system in the world at the time. So the Chinese were very progressive in this nature with their meritocracy. These time periods was also great innovations, a lot of inventions and new ideas. The Grand Canal was very important. It's going to link South and Northern China together, the agricultural lands in the South to Northern lands. You'll see a huge increase in steel and iron production. We know how important iron and steel are, weapons and building materials, things of that nature. Allowed farm tools to be stronger, more efficient. Very important, we get Champa rice, which is this fast ripening rice, of course. It's going to basically give them they can harvest like twice in a year and stuff. Creates a surplus of food. More food, of course, equals more people. So you have a population boom in this time period. Also, during this time period, China created a unique porcelain and silk luxury goods that were highly desired trade goods. The Silk Roads, porcelain and silk traveling along them, and people want them all over the world, and they're going to make the Chinese very rich. These innovations allowed fewer people to farm and more people to become artisans or laborers who lived in urban areas. So you have migration, internal migration coming from the farms to the cities. And this led to something called proto industrialization, which is sort of like, so think of the Industrial Revolution. It's not quite that level that begins in Britain, but it's beginning. You see urbanization, they're beginning to produce these industrialized goods, just not the assembly line and as advanced as what you'll see in Europe later. Religion, we're going to call, I suppose, Confucianism a religion, although it's not really a religion here. It's more of a belief system, but you can use it interchangeably. So the first major religion in Song China was Confucianism, which emphasized filial piety, just the idea that men were the head of the household, and so their needs came first. The eldest male in the household is going to be the most important. When new religions entered China, the government was hesitant to give up Confucianism and this idea. So they're going to view things like Christianity and Islam as threats to the status quo. Now, Confucianism doesn't exist by itself. There's also Buddhism, and Buddhism came to China via the Silk Road. We know that Buddhism, of course, came from India with Siddhartha Gautama. It combined with Taoism or Daoism to create something called Zen Buddhism, which is basically a Chinese version of Buddhism. It became popular among Chinese people, but it was resisted by the Confucianists. Neo-Confucianism, New Confucianism, rose in Song China as a response to the rise of Buddhism. Buddhism becoming more popular, so this is their answer to that, if you will. Now, the one belief system that they don't mention here on this slide is legalism, of course, which was the favorite of people like Shi Huangdi. And legalism, of course, it was the idea behind it was that you punish people severely for mistakes and you reward them handsomely for good things. Unfortunately, it focused more on the negative, but the government liked legalism, as you can imagine. Social stratification. Song China was the most urbanized land in the world, meaning they had more cities. They had, even in this time period, they had over 10 cities with 1 million people in them. There was some social mobility in China with the emperor at the top. You had the scholar gentry, people who had been educated in the Confucian philosophy. They were next on the ladder. Then they were followed by farmers, artisans and craftsmen, and the merchant class. At the bottom were the peasants and the poor, which of course constitutes a large percentage of the people of China. Women defer to men for all things. You see the rise of foot binding in this time period, which essentially handicaps the women. They are, they are dependent upon the men in their lives to, do things for them. Tributary system also arises in this time period. States surrounding China had to pay a tribute to China in the form of money or goods. Basically, this is to stay in China's good graces. So you sort of see this with the United States and their sphere of influence on this side of the world, much later in history, of course. But the idea is to keep on China's good side. You don't want to be attacked by them, and they're a good friend to have if somebody's messing with you. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam are always heavily influenced by China. Japan adopted Buddhism and Confucianism, but they weren't as centrally governed. Remember, it's not going to be till the Tokugawa shogunate that Japan actually unifies. Korea was very close to China. They share a border, and they had a centralized system of government, and they used Confucianism as their educational system. They used Buddhism as well as part of their religion. Vietnam adapted the Chinese system of writing, but they resisted sinification. Sinification meaning it's like assimilation into Chinese values due to their unique views on the family and culture. Okay, so that's a China in a nutshell, if you will, as a review. Dar al-Islam, our time period here, we're going to go 1200 to 1450. After the death of Muhammad, Islam spread rapidly through the 3 M's: military actions, merchants, and missionaries. They're traveling along those Silk Roads. They're going everywhere, spreading the faith. They are also very militarily capable, especially under the Umayyad dynasty, which spreads. You can see how enormous the Islamic Empire was. After the fall of the pre-1200 Abbasid Caliphate, there was not one unified Islamic government, but regional Islamic empires collectively known as Dar al-Islam, which means everything Islam touches. There are huge advances in math, literature, and medicine in this time period. So you have two dynasties, the Umayyads, which do most of the conquering here, and then they're only around for about 100 years. And of course, remember that they're all invited to a party and massacred, and the Abbasids take over here. And with the Abbasids, this is slowly going to shrink. Turks and people like that are going to take away from them, and Al-Andalus is going to break away from them. They're still loosely. It's like a confederation. They're still connected. Oops, I'm going backwards. They're still connected, but it's not all one centralized government at that point. All right, so these are the following groups that established their own Muslim empires after attacking and fragmenting the once unified Abbasid Caliphate. You had the Mamluks down in Egypt, who were Turkish slaves who actually attacked and seized control of the Egyptian government. That's going to be known as the Mamluk Sultanate. You had the Seljuk Turks. These were Muslim Turks who captured parts of the Middle East, including Baghdad, capital of modern-day Iraq. You had Al-Andalus in Spain, Muslim empire in Spain that represented tolerance and collaboration between numerous religions in Muslim-occupied territories. They're close to Christianity. They're to Christian-dominated Europe, of course. Al-Andalus today shows lots of Muslim influence in both its architecture and art. Here's a couple of notable people. Nasruddin al-Tusi, who's a celebrated Islamic scholar, made a lot of advances in math that laid the groundwork for things such as trigonometry. And then you had Bayanya, who was the most prolific female Muslim writer before the 20th century. Medical advances, doctors and pharmacists began studying for certification tests, greatly increasing standards of medical care. Again, it's the idea that you should have a certain standard of knowledge to be a quote-unquote doctor or a pharmacist. Cultural continuities. Remember, continuities are things that stay the same. Islamic scholars were known for taking learning from numerous cultures and building upon it. They loved the Greeks. They translated Greek classics into Arabic. They studied their math from India, because the Indians, you get your Indi numerals and stuff like that. And they made paper from China. So, they're going to look at other people's great things. They're going to take them one step more and increase them. All right, South and Southeast Asia. In the pre-1200 world, the golden age of India ended when the Gupta Empire fell. You had the Mauryans and the Gupta empires during the classical age, but after the Gupta fall, it results in 1,000 years of decentralization, meaning that India, a large area, is going to be broken into many, many competing kingdoms. South and Southeast Asia are characterized by interactions between Islam and Hinduism, the growth of trade, and the continuation of decentralized systems of government. So your theme here is decentralization in all these areas. But you also had the Indian Ocean trade. Okay. South and Southeast Asia were largely decentralized, with regional empires growing over time. In South Asia, you had the Delhi Sultanate, which was, of course, Muslim dominated. That's going to be in the mostly northwest corner of India. You had Vijayanagar, which were Hindu or people native to the Indian area, the native religion of Hinduism. In Southeast Asia, you had the Srivijaya Empire, which was also Hindu, the Majapahit, which was Buddhist, the Khmer Empire, which was Hindu and then Buddhist. This region was heavily influenced by the trade relationship it had with surrounding regions. We know that trade brings religions, of course. So you got more mixing here in India. But we know also that India itself is going to be very dominated by Hinduism. 75% of the people are going to be Hindu, with about 25% being Muslim. Islam greatly influenced the region, with many merchants converting to Islam to have a stronger trade relationship with Muslim nations. Merchants are responsible for bringing Islam to Southeast Asia. If you think back to the slide about Dar al-Islam, that was one of the 3 M's: merchants, military, and all that good stuff. Some Hindus converted to Islam to escape the caste system. So remember, the caste system was a fairly rigid system. Basically, you're poor because you deserve to be poor. That's your fault. Better luck in the next life. And so people who wanted to escape that ideology, Islam was a notable way to do that. All right, state building in the Americas. All right, pre 1200, the first empire that grew in the Americas was the Toltecs. They were highly militaristic with a heavy focus on sacrifice. The Toltec Empire probably fell due to repeated attack by northern nomads. Now, the Aztecs, or as they were also known, the Mexica, arose in the 13th century near Lake Texcoco, which allowed them to farm, fish, and for transportation. By 1434, Aztecs dominated the valley by conquering other city-states and creating a tributary empire. They're very tough and oppressive rulers, and basically people are going to have to give them money so they don't slaughter them. They made surrounding regions pay them prisoners, goods, and money, which kept the Aztecs rich and the other peoples poor. That's going to play a role when the Spanish come. That's certainly going to help Native Americans help Cortez conquer the Aztec Empire. The capital city of Tenochtitlan was filled with farming, awesome places, and exciting markets. Rulers were considered gods on earth, which gave them a tremendous amount of power. As big of one of the biggest cities in the world, Tenochtitlan at the time, certainly bigger than anything in Europe when the Spanish arrived. You're talking 300,000-400,000 people in a highly organized city. But the Aztecs are not the only ones. Of course, to the south in South America, you had the Inca Empire, which was centered around Lake Titicaca in Peru, highly centralized, with a main ruler who ruled over 4 large provinces. Local leaders would rule, but they are still going to defer to the Inca in the end. They also create a tributary system. Carpanan connected the large empire. It was one of the largest roads in the world at the time. With all these checkpoints, sort of like an interstate system. You had rest areas and things like that. Advanced irrigation made the Inca skilled farmers, because remember, they're up here in the Andes Mountains, and it's tough farming, but they were very good at irrigation. They were some of the greatest builders in the world. They've been compared to the Romans, been called the Romans of the West because of their engineering feats, all done without concrete even. All right, some similarities here. Built on earlier empires that preceded them, the Aztecs built off of the Toltecs and the Olmecs before them. The Inca built off the Chamorro. Differences: the Aztecs have sophisticated traders and markets, whereas the Inca have no specialized merchant class. So some differences there. The Aztecs, excellent imperial and military organizers. The Aztecs have a writing system. The Inca do not. The Inca use something called a quipu, which is knotted strings that records basically merchant activities, trading activities, but they don't have, none of their stories and mythologies or anything are written down. They're passed orally. Highly organized agricultural sector under state control. Don't forget the Aztecs had the floating gardens, the chinapas, which allowed them to create large amounts of food. Ethnic groups were allowed to survive. The Inca incorporate them into their empire, whereas the Aztecs ruled them very harshly. If you were an Aztec, you didn't matter. Animistic religions are similar here, and none of them had draft animals for labor. The biggest animal you have on this side of the world as far as domestication is the llama. And so they don't have horses, they don't have oxen and things like that to use for labor. The Maya were another major group. The Maya were centered in the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Mexico and northern Guatemala. They were decentralized with many Maya city-states spread throughout the region. Often these city-states would go to war with each other. And the Maya were known for their art, architecture, their advanced calendar, and astronomical system. Other tribes in the Americas, spread throughout the Americas, tribes were varied depending on their environment. Most empires were weakened by European contact. Now, in North America, what's today modern day United States of America and Canada, you had an incredible variety of tribes. You had plains tribes, you had coastal tribes, woodland tribes, Mississippian tribes. I mean, just a smorgasbord. But in North America, you had no major, what we might call high civilizations like you saw with the Aztec, the Mayans, and the Inca. And of course, European contact's going to weaken everybody. All right, state building in Africa. Before Islam came to Africa, the societies were extremely diverse. They were animistic and polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods, and a lot of them were based off the incredible amount of animals in Africa. They had varying economies. Most of the people spoke the Bantu language. Remember, the Bantu people spread not only their language, but their knowledge of metalwork and agriculture through Africa. Very important. Basically, they're going to start just below the Saharan Desert, and they're going to spread throughout Central and Southern Africa, taking their civilization with them, their language with them. Many African societies were stateless, meaning they didn't have an organized and centralized government. The people just existed. Here's your job as a man. Here's your job as a woman. Here's your job as a 14-year-old kid. Here's your job as a 6-year-old kid. And, you had these age groups, and you just lived. You didn't really need a government because you're talking villages of 100 people, and 100 people can make things work without a government. Stateless societies were largely weak. They had no tax systems or large building projects. Again, you're talking 100, 200 people. There's only so much they can or are willing to do or even need to do. Now, Islam comes to Africa from missionaries and merchants, and many people converted because Islam was egalitarian, meaning that that there's some equality there, with the focus on the authority of the king. Conversion to Islam gave early African societies equal footing to Arabic societies and better trade opportunities within the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. That one's possibly the biggest reason why so many Africans converted to Islam. It made monetary sense for them. It gave them advantages in trade that they would not have had otherwise. Now, the Trans-Saharan trade, meaning across the Sahara Desert, it was improved by the use of camels, and the camels sat on caravans. Trade allowed empires to grow along the network through importing their goods and trading with other kingdoms. So you're going to get our West African empires. You need to remember them. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. They became Islamic to grow their political power. They traded with other Muslim nations, which in this time period are very strong and powerful and rich. They set up tributary systems on a small scale. In Central Africa, Islam did not spread to this region. It was difficult to travel through the jungles of Central Africa, and states formed more slowly without the Islamic influence to kind of beef them up. You had Great Zimbabwe. It was large, but it was also non-Islamic. It dominated African gold and trade on the coastal ports in the Indian Ocean network, so it's going to be in the east. And they built this great wall for protection. You're talking 15, 20,000 people in Great Zimbabwe. You're not going to have huge cities in Africa for a long time, and really not until the Muslims arrive. You had Ethiopia, or otherwise known as Axum. It was a link between the Arab and the Mediterranean world. They were exposed to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and lots of trade because of their proximity to Eurasia. All right, that's going to be here in this area. The spread of Islam opened Africa up to the global trade, but most of Africa developed independently. So these areas up here are going to be in the trade, but these areas down there will not. All right, developments in Western Europe. After the fall of the Roman Empire, of course, Western Europe was left mostly decentralized. We get something known as the Middle Ages, or a sense of backwardness in Europe. The governments are weak here, decentralized. Learning was slow compared to the rest of the world. Europe is the hicks. They're the hillbillies of the world in this time period. Around 1100, Europe slowly begins to come out of the Middle Ages. Religion, Christianity is the dominant main religion throughout Western Europe. And while many places trade with Asia, Africa, and Arab nations, there was a deep fear of other religions. The church, the Catholic Church, remember it's the Catholic Church in the West, the Orthodox Christian Church in the East. They are very suspicious of any other religions. You get witch hunts, you get the burning of heretics and all that good stuff. In a time of decentralization, religion held many places in Europe together. That is, Europe is a place of a lot of different ethnic groups, but one thing that unified them was that they were all Roman Catholics. The Catholic Church was highly organized and it became the most powerful institution in Europe. However, it was highly corrupt in many places, which will later on lead, of course, to the Reformation. Christian crusades tried to end Muslim rule in the Holy Land. It was successful in some places, but most importantly, it opened up the West to trade. Pope Urban II gives the first call for a crusade in 1095, and the idea being to regain Jerusalem, although some people believe it was really to get rid of unruly knights who were causing problems in Europe. Regardless, the first crusade is the only really successful one for Christians out of 8 or 9 crusades. The rest are, it's pretty much just open. This part right here, it opens up the West to trade. And it's important. It's going to help bring us out of the Dark Ages as we see, as Europeans see silk and porcelain and salt and all these fine luxuries for the first time. Manorialism, the manor system, existed during a time of decentralization. Landowners would have peasants or even serfs. Remember, serfs were legally bound to the land. They would work and live on the lord's land. In exchange, the lord of the manor would provide protection for the serfs. If you didn't live on a manor, if you were somebody out there farming, you were a victim to any kind of bad person that came along that wanted to kill you and take your stuff. So by living in the manor system, you had to do what the Lord said, but he also protected you. Manors were isolated with low levels of production and very low technology. They were vulnerable to Viking raids due to their isolation during the Viking period. Not the best system, but it did create a system of local rule with regional aristocrats. These are your lords, basically, who live here in the manor house. Each one of these is going to have a church, and everybody's going to be required to be at church on Sunday. All right, here's your European feudalism, military and political system that provided more protection from Viking raids. The rules provided protection and aid to lesser lords who were vassals. If you're a vassal, it means you owed allegiance to the person ahead of you. The nobles employed knights for protection, and peasants worked the land in exchange for protection and a place to live. Essentially slaves to the king. Yeah, essentially. A feudal monarch slowly grew, and manors were absorbed into larger kingdoms. We kind of start getting our nation states coming along. Over time, feudalism created a very unhappy population of peasants who are always at the will of these people here. And eventually, it takes a very long time, they will escape from feudalism. Over time, feudalism slowly transformed into a monarchy, with many movements in place to limit both the Catholic Church and the feudal system. In the High Middle Ages, it was a time where feudalism decreased and industrialization increased. This led to an increase in education and urbanization. When we think of education, we think to Charlemagne in 800, who starts putting an emphasis on education. Agriculture improves in this time period, and technology begins to catch up with the rest of the world, slowly but surely. Unfortunately, we get the plague, the Black Death, in the middle. It hits Europe in the mid-1300s, biggest in Europe around 1347 to 1351. Half of the European population dies, and this is one of the best things that could happen for them because the labor force in Europe is slashed, and peasants are now not as expendable, and they're going to revolt against their overlords, and they're going to get better working conditions. And life is going to get better actually after the Black Death, weirdly enough. Many people began to build guilds, which were basically like early unions to control their working conditions. All right, guys, that is it. That is your Unit 1 review. You got to write this stuff down. You got to take notes. You got to process it. The rest of this week, the rest of the videos that go with this, I'm going to give you assignments that will basically, continue on these things that we've introduced here in this overview. Okay. Thank you. Your virtual hours, guys, my virtual office hours are from 12 to 1. And for your class, we're going to go with a 15-minute chunk from 12:15 to 12:30. Doesn't mean you can't get on any other times, but I think it'll be better if all my WAP students are in there together at one time versus having all my classes in there at one time. I think it'll be very chaotic. Okay. Now you can email me at any time with any questions that you have.